Hello, my name is Byron Bridges. You just finished watching two different video clips. The first one shows a woman taking written English and explaining it in ASL. The second one shows a man typing in English on a TTY, which is a telecommunication device for the deaf, and communicating to someone else in ASL. Both videos show a person receiving one language and producing another. This is bilingualism, and we're going to discuss this interesting topic in more depth. To the general public, bilingualism is when you speak two languages fluently, and you can go between them interchangeably. Let's see if the deaf community's perspective is different from the non-deaf.
For me, bilingualism means that people are skilled in both American Sign Language and English.
When I think of bilingualism, I picture someone who is fluent in two languages. The language a person primarily uses depends on where a person lives or works. If you move to a new place, you will need to learn the language used there, but the type of language you use with family might be different. You might see multiple languages used throughout your family, work, or school, such as French or German.
In my case, bilingualism means being proficient in both Mexican Sign Language and American Sign Language, and being able to easily transition between using both languages. When I am in America, I use American Sign Language, but I am still able to use Mexican Sign Language with my relatives when they visit from Mexico. And if friends from America visit me, I am able to use American Sign Language with them.
Seeing and expressing American Sign Language, reading and writing English, those are very different. I can use ASL to have debates, banter, and poke fun at my peers, while I use English when I read the newspaper and write my homework, and also when I read closed captions on the TV. Bilingualism means being proficient enough to use both.
For me, bilingualism means being able to understand both American Sign Language and English. It means that I am able to hear spoken English and produce American Sign Language. I am also able to see American Sign Language and understand the meaning.
The deaf community defines bilingualism as being proficient in ASL and English. The non-deaf perspective differs in the sense that it includes other spoken languages, such as French and Spanish. In both communities, to be bilingual is to be able to use both languages interchangeably. The concept of bilingualism is identical whether you're talking about non-deaf, deaf, and other languages. So now we're going to discuss how you can learn two languages and become bilingual.
I was born the only deaf person in my family. When I was 17 years old, I went to Gallaudet, a deaf university. Before that, I was only reading, writing, and speaking English. I didn't know anything about American Sign Language or the deaf culture. Stepping onto that campus, I walked into a deaf world. Everything was visually accessible. I was copying what I was seeing, and I was able to learn ASL from those around me. That was about 10 years ago now. That experience helped me find my identity. I not only learned ASL, but eventually moved on to learn Italian and Quebec Sign Language as well. Knowing several languages is a good skill to have.
To fully answer your question, you should know that I am from Australia. In Australia, our signed language is called Auslan. I grew up with parents who are deaf. Our family used Auslan for everyday communication. For a long time, this was the only language I knew. I remember learning this first language as a child. I learned through interactions with my family. When I wanted something, I would point to it. My mom would sign yes in response and give me the item. I didn't really understand what she meant, but I eventually associated the sign she used to the meaning yes. Later, when visiting my aunt, she decided to teach me another language. I remember wanting an apple and pointing to it. My aunt would respond by signing Y-E-S. At first, I was confused, but then she explained that the letters she spelled out meant yes. I was still confused for a long time after that, but at the time all I understood was that I was able to have the apple. This is how my journey into bilingualism began. As I got older, I went to a school where I was taught English, and this schooling helped me become more comfortable with this second language. It wasn't until I moved to America that I learned a third language, American Sign Language.
How did I become bilingual? Well, me and my parents are both deaf, so I learned from watching and talking with them with my tiny little hands. When it came time for me to be admitted to school, I was so excited because I had watched my sister go to and from school many times throughout the week. I held my mom's hand as we walked into the school, and we met the supervisor in the hall. They began signing and talking at the same time. I didn't fully understand what they were talking about, so I looked to the kids, and they were signing like wild animals. They were all over the place. There were so many signs I didn't recognize at all. One of the teachers I met didn't sign much, and they overemphasized their mouth movements. Anyway, I had to follow the rules of written English, which is different than ASL. When I got home, though, I tried to use some of these new signs with my parents, and they told me not to use those words because it was not proper ASL. So I ended up using different signing styles at home and school to get along with everybody.
I grew up in Mexico, and my first language was Mexican Sign Language. We moved to America when I was 8, and I went to the school for the deaf. I had trouble understanding words that the teacher would spell in class. When I would spell, I would use an accented letter N. My teacher told me that we don't use the accented N in American Sign Language. That was the first time I realized that I had two languages.
I remember learning my first language, and really I had no language until I was about 3 years old. My parents would point at things and gesture before that. There was a deaf couple who taught me sign language, which I picked up rapidly. Soon I knew everything about the world around me. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, I was enrolled in deaf preschool where I was taught English. I would sign with my teachers, and I was able to swap between both English and American Sign Language.
I am not deaf. I grew up without any exposure to American Sign Language. When I was 18 or 19 years old, I took an ASL course where I learned some basic communication. After that class, I took other ASL classes. 2 or 3 years later, I became a certified interpreter. I've continued to learn American Sign Language. Now I'm fluent in both English and ASL.
It's fascinating to see how the deaf and non-deaf communities acquire another language. The non-deaf community learns auditorily, while the deaf community learns visually. The two are very different from each other, along with the experiences each community had while growing up. Now we're going to see how the two languages are used every day in the deaf community, if they are even used every day. Let's take a closer look.
Every morning I read the newspaper, which is in written English. When I find something interesting, I discuss it with my roommate using American Sign Language. Sometimes we agree, and sometimes we disagree. In class, we read and write in English, but when we discuss the topic, of course we use American Sign Language.
Growing up in Australia, I use two languages regularly. The deaf community there primarily uses Auslan. We also have access to teletype writers, which are more commonly known as a TTY. This device is used to convert a telephone conversation into text, making it accessible for deaf and hard of hearing individuals to read the message and respond. When typing messages on the TTY, we use English. We also use English to read newspapers. TTY and newspapers are good examples to show that regular reading and writing are primarily done in English. However, for conversations within the deaf community, we sign using Auslan. This is why I go back and forth between English and Auslan very regularly. When I moved to the United States, I had to go back through the process of learning another language. I worked at it and eventually learned my third language, American Sign Language. Here I use both English and ASL for everyday communication. I still use English for reading and writing and ASL to communicate with my deaf peers. When friends from Australia come to visit me in the States, I get to use all three languages. I switch back to using Auslan with my Australian friends, and oftentimes I interpret between my friends who use ASL and friends who use Auslan. I've become proficient enough to be considered trilingual and go back and forth between ASL, Auslan, and English.
I do use my bilingualism every day. For instance, I tend to watch a lot of TV using English captioning. I'm able to follow along fine with no problem at all. But sometimes my friend won't understand what the captions are trying to say. They ask me to sign that sentence to them in ASL, and then they understand. That in itself shows that ASL and English are two separate languages.
Yes, I use my bilingualism every day. For example, if I go to class and the teacher passes out an assignment written in English where the instructions are not clear, I am able to go discuss it with a group of my classmates in ASL to gain a better understanding. Then, I go sit at the computer and type up my homework in English.
If I go out to eat with friends, I have to read the menu, which is in English. But when we discuss the options, we use American Sign Language. And when the server comes to take our orders, we use some gestures and we will write in English if we need to. It all works out in the end.
How do I use both languages? I used to teach English to deaf students. During the lessons, I would write English sentences on the board. When we came across a concept the students didn't understand, I would explain it in American Sign Language. That way, they would understand the meaning in both ASL and English, which ultimately led to improved skills in both languages.
After watching those video clips, you can see that both communities have different functions for their bilingualism. In the non-deaf world, you can switch between languages while having a face-to-face conversation, over the phone, or during any verbal communication. The deaf community is different. They can use their bilingualism with a TTY, which is written in English, and producing the message in ASL. Since both communities have different functions, this is a prime example that both communities can freely switch back and forth between the two languages. Several deaf people know more than two languages. We're about to watch some examples of deaf people using their other sign language. Well, I thought that was very interesting. Anyways, I hope you all learned about the differences in languages. We've condensed the meaning behind bilingualism and everything that it entails. I hope that everyone who was involved in this video and viewed it encourages others to understand what it means to know two languages. Some people, including parents and people of power, are afraid to ask questions and are unsure if it's a good idea to teach their kids a second language. As we've seen in this video, there are numerous benefits to being bilingual and even trilingual. This is a prime example that deaf people can learn 2, 3, even 4 languages and be fluent in all of them. I hope this will encourage you all to encourage more deaf children to become bilingual and teach them what it means to be bilingual. I hope you all support the idea of bilingualism. Thank you.